Just kind of ping me with questions as I'm going through, because I'm just doing this off of my PowerPoints from last year. So I don't know if they've changed anything for you guys this year. I will answer to the best of my ability. It's kind of a crash course review for me too. So I will get going. Before we get started, any general questions about tests, about test taking? Okay. Okay, so first and foremost, I'm going to start with the muscle block because I think it's one of the more straightforward ones. And let's kind of tie it in together. Three types of muscle. Hopefully you guys know that by now. Otherwise, we're going to priority. Skeletal muscle is the most common. The big mental thing to keep in mind about skeletal muscle is it is pretty much on or off. There is no break. It fires or it doesn't fire. What dictates the amount of force is how many motor units you are recruiting. So, what's a motor unit? So it is one neuron in every muscle fiber that it innervates. So one neuron can have all these different projections going out to like 20 fibers in my biceps. So when that one fires, it'll generate a decent amount of force. If another one fires that only has one like motor unit in it and one fiber, not as much force. So that's how we control the volume of skeletal muscle contraction. As opposed to smooth muscle, which has this big convoluted system with common and MLCK and all that whole thing, it doesn't have any sarcomeres. That's the identifying thing about smooth muscle and why it's not striated. It doesn't do that because its contractions tend to be that peristaltic ring type of contraction. So last up is cardiac muscle. The big thing to know about cardiac muscle is mainly cardiac muscle is going to fire no matter what you do. Unless that muscle is dead, it will fire. The only thing that neuro input does is tell it how fast and how hard to contract. But it's going to do it regardless because it has its own two pacemakers. So again, second year is kind of mentally remind yourselves what those two pacemakers are, just keep tabs on it. Skeletal muscle is one of the big things that Miller likes to ask questions about is the length tension relationship. So what is length tension? Why do we care? So give me an example. Yeah, so think about the bottom part of a pull-up. What's the hardest part? The bottom, because everything's really stretched out. Once you get past that, okay, then you can get the rest of it, because your muscle is now at this optimal length. But when you stretch it out too far, it's reaching for that grip, and so it's not going to be able to generate a ton of force. And same thing if it's really close together. You can only move so much more, so you're not going to get a ton of power out of it. And so that's that graph that I'll show you where you start with kind of low, and then it peaks in tension, and then it kind of trails back up. Yeah.
Is that because the myosin and actin are like so far away from each other?
Yeah. So if these are my myosin fibers, if they can only grab onto like the very tail end of the actin fibers, I can't generate much force yet. Okay. Until I start to shorten and start to really start to pull.
This is our lecture.
Okay. Is it on your exam?
Yeah.
Cool. Then you're getting correct force and muscle physio. So the way that muscles operate, so you'll start with a muscle belly. That's the big body of a muscle. And you go into all of these subunits. It's a pain in the butt. Memorize it. Fasciculus to muscle fiber to myofibril to sarcomere. Sarcomere is the functional unit of a muscle. So this is individually what's going to be doing the contraction. When I move up to here, all of these individual striations will be myosin, actin, myosin, myosin, and just kind of overlapping on each other until you get into muscle fibers. Have you guys done your muscle histo with the rule?
Yeah.
So you know about like the muscle version of endomerium, periverium, yeah. Know that. She likes to ask that question. Okay. So the big thing, basically, what ion do we need to force a muscle to fire? Calcium. And so second years remember what the problem is with status epilepticus. Excess calcium leads to not just muscle damage, but also neuron damage. So calcium is a good thing. Too much is a bad thing. Too much leads to what's a state where your muscle is just contracted and you cannot relax that down. So that's when calcium just doesn't go away. So this structure, this invagination of membrane, this is your T-tubule, and it goes in all of your muscle cells. And why does it do that?
You can fire all at the same time.
To propagate and activate the membrane. This is the muscular version of a myelin, basically. is this is how one action potential will spread the length of a muscle cell. So you have your sarcoplasmic reticulum, and what does it hold? Calcium. So that's waiting to dump all this calcium into a muscle cell. But it can't do it until it gets an action potential. So I should relabel this. This is not calcium-generated. It's calcium going into the muscle. So what's coming from here will be an action potential that basically there will be a plug blocking off either side of that sarcoplasmic reticulum. When an action potential comes in and you get all this charge coming in, this gate lifts out of the way, charge goes into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it will discharge calcium. And that's how everything gets into the muscle cell. And yeah.
What did it compare to now?
The T2Cs. So this is basically the gatekeeper of a muscle contractor. Because remember, once calcium goes into a muscle cell, it's all or nothing. It's gonna fire or it's not. And so a muscle contraction is going to go on as long as there is calcium in that muscle cell. So that's why having this sarcoplasmic reticulum is important, because after it has discharged all that calcium, it's going to try to start scooping it back up again. If there's a problem with it, tetanus. So this is your functional sarcomere. It's that, but just in slightly bigger scale. Dr. Miller will want you to know Z lines, I lines, A bands, and H zones. The I line, or I band, I didn't bother to draw on here because you have to have two sarcomeres next to each other. H zone is this middle, like, space where your actin, thin fibers, are not overlapping with your myosin fibers. That is your H zone. So I remember that it's hollow, there's no overlap here. A band is the length of your mighty myosin fibers. Those are the big fat chains that will actually pull the actin along. So when a muscle contracts, what on the diagram is moving? So the H zone will change, it will get smaller. It's moving Z line to Z line. Those two sides are being pulled in. So the myosin fibers don't actually move. It's the actin fibers that move from myosin getting a grip on it and pulling it forward. So this is functionally you standing at the gym pulling on a cable. This is the weight that's moving. But you stay stationary. Okay. Power stroke. He will for sure ask you questions about how muscles actually fire. You will start with the myosin, with these other little myosin heads down here. They are not yet attached to an actin fiber. They're just kind of sitting in space. They have an ATP with them. What makes it unique is the ATP it's holding is already hydrolyzed. It's already ATP and inorganic phosphate. But it can't do anything until it can bind onto actin. As soon as it binds actin, it will power stroke. But until it gets a binding site, it's just kind of sitting there waiting. So your muscles are always kind of primed to contract, but they have to be given the go-ahead. So that's where that calcium reflux comes in. Because what's the structure that's covering all of the actin? Tropomyosin. And so when calcium comes in and binds tropomyosin, it pulls tropomyosin off of actin, myosin can bind, and it will power stroke. You now have a myosin head that has pulled all the way along an actin fiber. But it's stuck there. It can't leave until a new ATP comes in. It's already at this bent position. So ATP will come in and bind the myosin head, and it will detach from actin. But it still can't go anywhere until that ATP hydrolyzes back to its starting position. And then you have a hydrolyzed ATP, bind power stroke, bind power stroke. And that will be the cycle of muscle contraction. Any questions on that? Cool. And again, that process will continue until you start to lose calcium. And when you lose calcium, why does your muscle contraction stop?
Because it can't bind.
It can't
once
bind
without the
actin.
tropomyosin.
Tropomyosin will come right back on and bind. So, we talked about this, you can't detach unless a new ATP binds. There is a pathology, well, I shouldn't say pathology, it's relevant in forensics. Why does this matter? Rigor mortis. That's why this happens. Is all the muscles are now contracted and they cannot unwind because there's no ATP coming in, so you're stuck that way. That's your crash course in muscles. Good to go on that? Cool. Nerves. Nerves are awesome and they will come back time and time again. I'm assuming basic neuron structure is pretty okay for you guys? Okay. So I'm going to skip that part. I personally have had dendrites and axons rammed down my throat enough times. I'm good. axonal transport. You kind of will only talk about it once, but it's important. Tutor will for sure ask you questions about it. Anterograde versus retrograde, it really only differs in the direction that things are traveling. How do they differ in terms of what they're carrying?
Retrograde is mostly dead cells, I think.
Dead cells?
Used up stuff.
Used up.
Dead, broken stuff. Because this is already a cell, it can't really carry other cells in it. So the way I remember is, yeah, it does have to do with dynein. Dynein is the molecule that it's using to do that transport, and so it's carrying dead, damaged material back to the cell body to be degraded. Now, clinically, there are two things you care about with retrograde transport.
Rabies.
Rabies,
Contact.
Clostridium tetani bacteria, that toxin also uses retrograde transport. Now, anterograde transport is carrying macromolecules, anything to support healthy nerve function towards the axon in case it's going to get shipped out, in case that part of the cell isn't getting what it needs yet. That uses kinesin, kinesthetic, moving things towards the end of the axon. What cellular structure is actually doing the moving? Microtubules. So again, second years we talked about in HEMONC, there are a class of drugs that actively inhibit microtubules. That's why you will get peripheral neuropathy with chemo drugs, is you're basically destroying that transport and thus destroying nerve function. Now going to kind of crude neurohisto. You have your nerve, the outer covering is epineuron. Then you have all these fat bundles inside that are all surrounded by epineuron. Those are bound by perineuron. What's important about perineuron is that is the first barrier that you will hit that is permeable, that will actually let molecules through to get to the endoneurium and actually nourish cells. Because remember, one big nerve is huge bundles of neurons, individual neurons. So those have to get fed somehow. The perineuron is the only permeable barrier to let molecules in to feed those. You get to endoneurium, which is around individual neuron cells. What is this guy? A Schwann cell, and he is doing what? Now, Dr. Kuhr, I believe, also talked to you guys about neurofibromas versus schwannomas. Which is worse? Neurofibromas. Why? So, neurofibromas are dealing with the neuron itself. It is a tumor involving the actual neuron. So how do you cut that out without completely destroying a nerve? It would be problematic. If it's a schwannoma, that's a covering on the nerve. You can kind of tease that away from the actual nerve itself and probably save nerve function. But a neurofibroma, probably not going to happen. And again, second year's acoustic schwannomas. We talked about cranial nerve 7 and 8, balance, facial paralysis, all that good stuff. Neuroglia. So, astrocytes. Why do we care?
Babysitters. Like the babysitters of the nerve, right?
What does that mean?
Like feed it, make sure it's like protected. Like
Partly.
stay in one spot.
What's the really big reason we care about it? Blood-brain barrier. The perivascular end feet surround all your brain microvasculature and don't let anything get through unless they're supposed to, because your blood-brain barrier is made up of what kind of cell junctions?
Tight.
Tight junctions. You don't want gap junctions. So, astrocytes are also really important during embryological development, neuronal migration, telling things where to go. That's all your astrocytes.
I'm sorry, can you say again what they have to do with the blood-brain barrier?
These little perivascular end feet that they have seal off the microvasculature in the brain. Because otherwise you just have molecules diffusing out into the brain however they saw fit out of those vessels. So this basically makes a hard seal around those vessels. So the only thing getting into the brain are things that are permeable to get from the vasculature out through astrocytes into the brain. So they're basically the gatekeepers of that blood-brain barrier. Tumors are another big issue. Astrocytic tumors are very common. And also in terms of neuronal injury, astrocytic scars. If part of the brain atrophies or has an ischemic injury and it dies, that space will be filled with astrocytes afterwards. They just kind of go and plug up that hole. Oligodendrocytes, myelin sheath. What is multiple sclerosis?
Demyelination.
It's an autoimmune disease going after the myelin sheath. Again, second year, we haven't talked about multiple sclerosis yet. It is coming. Microglia. Yeah, they eat stuff. They cruise around in your brain and say, oh, that shouldn't be there. So it's kind of your brain's version of an immune system. Normally your brain is very sequestered from the rest of the body, so it doesn't really need any immune cells up there. Microglia cruise around and get rid of anything that shouldn't be there. Other important things about microglia. Second years, we just covered sleep. This is a theory about what happens during sleep, that you actually have dilation between your cell spaces, and these little microglia go in and clean out all of the metabolic debris. That's why we need sleep. Animal cells. Make CSF. Why do we need CSF? Mumbles. Come on, why do we need it? Nourishes our brain. It's isolated from everything else. CSF is the only way the brain is going to get nutrients and have an osmotic balance around it. If we do a lumbar puncture and you get cloudy CSF, what does that tell you? What kind of meningitis?
Spinal.
Bacterial.
Bacterial. Okay. Autonomic nervous system. Have you guys had your lecture with Dr. Geyer on autonomics or gotten that big fat packet? Know that packet inside out, backwards, upside down. It will matter over and over and over and over. It's not on the test. I'm assuming he just gave it to you?
It's like a week ago, 2 weeks ago.
We turned it in.
Okay, so you turned it in. Be familiar with it. You guys are going to go back into autonomic drugs, and that will be a bear if you don't know it. So just keep it on the back burner. So autonomic nervous system, what does it do?
Homeostasis.
It's up there, visceral motor. So anything that is affecting your gut, your glands, anything that is not a skeletal muscle or your heart is all autonomics. So we have sympathetic, parasympathetic. Where is sympathetic? Thoracolumbar. And how does sympathetic differ from parasympathetic in terms of location? So thoracolumbar versus? What are the cranial nerves that are parasympathetic?
3, 7, 9, 10.
Which are?
Vegas.
So pharyngeal, vagus. In terms of structure, we have two different neurons, pre and postganglionic. How do they differ? Sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Which one's which?
Sympathetic is short, synaptic, and
Mm-hmm. So structurally, what do we have in sympathetic that we don't have in the parasympathetic? A chain ganglia. So that is always how you will identify sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Parasympathetic likes to go all the way out to your viscera and then synapse. Both of these, you will see varicosities. What are varicosities? And so why do we need those? Varicosities are bulges on your axon that will go all the way down that will release neurotransmitter.
Peristalsis and smooth muscle.
So if these are innervating visceral motor, then their job is to be able to cover, you have a lot of viscera, it's covering a lot of expansive stuff. So its job is basically to provide motor feedback that whole way, and rather than having umpteen billion different neurons going there, you would rather have one axon that can cover a big chunk of space. Membrane potential. Everybody's favorite. Know the Nernst equation. Yeah.
I had a question about the sympathetic chain ganglia. I think you told us in the last that there are 3 options for every presynaptic.
Yes.
It can either snaps at that level, or it can move up and down, or it can go to a paravertical and maybe prevertical. So what does that mean? It's either going up or it's going straight out, right?
It's just kind of how you get mixing of nerves. It's really the only thing you need to know about it. It's just saying that if you have a lesion of a nerve, it might correspond to the spinal level that you're talking about, but they might also be getting input from a different spinal area. So that's partly how your body covers the bases of giving input to a body region, so that if your spinal cord is lesioned or wherever it's lesioned, you still have input from other levels in the spinal cord, so that isolated lesion isn't gonna totally knock everything out. It's just covering the bases. Okay, so the membrane potential. So the Nernst equation, super important. Miller will want you to know it. He likes the question about what happens if you disrupt the sodium-potassium pump. So what happens?
Everything goes to zero.
And what happens when it goes to zero?
No potential.
No potential, so it doesn't necessarily die. So what happens when you get the tinglies? You have no nerve signal. That's why you get tinglies. You're not getting any sensation. If you've been sleeping on your arm all night, and you wake up and you can't feel your hand, you don't have any nerve sensation because the pumps are inhibited because you were compressing it, you weren't getting any blood flow. No blood flow, no ATP, no pump. These three membrane potentials, know them. They will come up in calculations, they'll come up in questions, just know it. He loves questions of, if you only open your potassium receptors part way, what happens to the membrane potential? If you open your sodium channels all the way, what happens to your membrane potential? He should have given you a bunch of practice questions for those.
Yeah.
Know those, you'll be fine. He doesn't throw any major curveballs.
Question?
Yeah.
On those practice questions, like, I could estimate it and then pick the correct one, but if you look at his, like, justification, he goes through the whole thing. Do we have to go through it? Does he throw curveballs or, like?
If you can guesstimate it, like, the way I went through that test was, cool, you've opened this channel, which one is it going closer to? Great. Okay, so time constant. He will also definitively ask you a time constant question. Be able to calculate a time constant. It's a pretty simple equation, so just be aware of it as a thing. Why do we care about time constant? So a single time constant is what? 63% of the way to steady state.
Or 37% on decay. Does that not matter?
Is what?
The decay.
Yeah. He won't talk about that as much. Steady state. That's why we care. So, what we're saying is, if we have a time constant, 1 is how long it takes me to get 2/3 of the way up to this level. So if I have a really big time constant, that means I have a really slow neuron, right? Because it's taking me a really long time to get to this steady state value. Know that it depends on membrane resistance and membrane capacitance. So that's both of those things are going to be affecting your time constant. What is the equation for time constant? Is RC, right? So know the equation, it'll make it a lot easier to kind of infer these questions, because if you know the equation, you can infer it depends on resistance and capacitance. I find that easier than memorizing it, just kind of intuit it out. So by contrast, you have length constant. Length constant is how much that signal decays per unit length along a neuron. So the farther away you go, how much is that signal decayed? That depends on membrane resistance as well as cytoplasmic resistance. You now have a signal propagating through the cytoplasm, so if your resistance is high, you will get a lot of decay. This is the opposite of a time constant. Big number means it's fast, right? If you can go really far with not much decay, you have a big length constant. He, again, will for sure ask you questions about both of those things, so just be familiar with them as ideas. Know the relationship between the number of open channels and the time constant. If you open some of the channels, it's not going to go as fast as if you open all of them. So just keep that general idea in mind for his questions. Refractory period, yeah.
There was a practice question on this, and I was a little confused.
Yeah.
But just to clarify, if it has a large time constant, not only does it take a long time to get up to charge, but it also takes a long time to get down from charge. Okay.
And again, if you're thinking about that it depends on membrane resistance and capacitance, if you have a really high membrane resistance, things aren't going to transit very easily, so you're not going to have a rapid change in charge either way. Refractory periods, I can't remember if he asked a question about refractory periods. I mean, just be aware of them, absolute versus relative. What's the difference?
Relative use of the largest and zero.
Yeah, so, oh, I don't want that.
So I've gone,
You know how he does ask it, that cardiac muscle for skeletal muscle, right? Like
Yeah.
whether or not one's absolute, right? Because cardiac is absolute,
Yeah.
skeletal is relative. That's how he asks the question.
So just remember, like, there will be periods that you're in a relative refractory period, like in between action potentials, kind of a relative refractory period. You might be a little bit hyperpolarized, might need a little more oomph to get through. If you are so deeply hyperpolarized after an action potential, nothing's gonna fire, and you just have to concede that. Okay, we are going to take a breather while I write a whole bunch more stuff on the board. Can I erase this? Are we good? Any questions? Cool.